The pristine, snow-dusted peaks of the Colorado Rockies promised a fresh start, a canvas of untouched white. But beneath the glittering surface, an unspoken dread pulsed, a cold whisper carried on the alpine winds. I arrived at the ski resort, eager for the crisp air and the thrill of the slopes, only to find the staff operating under a set of rules so bizarre, so utterly chilling, they seemed designed not to keep guests safe, but to keep something else contained. And the most terrifying rule. It only applied after the last skier had left, when the mountain became a kingdom of shadows and silence, and the real residents came out to play. My grandfather always said, "Some mountains have teeth." He never mentioned they also had eyes. The thin mountain air bit at my cheeks, a refreshing, almost exhilarating sting as I stepped out of my beat-up sedan. The sign, carved from dark, sturdy pine, read, "Silverpeak Ski Resort, where the peaks touch the sky." Below it, a smaller, less ornate plaque added, almost as an afterthought, "Welcome home, home." A strange word for a place I'd never seen until a week ago, a place I'd taken sight unseen after a desperate phone interview, and a promise of cheap accommodation. But after the suffocating monotony of my cubicle farm existence in Phoenix, Silverpeak, nestled high in the Colorado Rockies, felt like a genuine escape. A blank slate, dusted in an inviting, pristine layer of snow. It was mid-October, the pre-season buzz already a low hum among the few early arrivals. Mostly staff like myself, and a scattering of hardcore enthusiasts testing the first patches of snow on the upper slopes. My job was entry-level, lift operator, then general maintenance once the season proper kicked off. Simple manual labor, a far cry from the soul-crushing spreadsheets I'd left behind. That was the dream anyway. The reality, I would soon discover, was far more textured. My new home was a cramped utilitarian room in the staff dormitory, a large, rustic-looking lodge set a little apart from the main resort buildings. It was functional, clean enough, with a sturdy bunk bed and a small, rickety desk by the single window. The view, however, was spectacular. A panorama of towering, snow-capped peaks, their jagged edges clawing at a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Below, the sprawling network of ski lifts, silent and still for now, snaked up the mountain like dormant serpents. It felt wild, untamed, and exactly what I needed. My first few days were a blur of training sessions. How to operate the lift safely, how to handle customer queries, basic first aid. It was all fairly standard dry stuff, delivered by older, weather-beaten staff members who had the weary look of people who'd seen too many winters. There was Mark, a burly, perpetually cheerful man in his late 50s who ran the lift operations, and Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who managed the dorms and general staff welfare. They seemed friendly enough, if a little reserved. It was during one of these training sessions, specifically a late afternoon briefing on off-hours resort protocols, that the first tremor of unease started to snake its way into my perfectly good mood. We were gathered in a small, dusty conference room in the main lodge, the last rays of sunlight slanting through the windows, painting the room in hues of orange and gold. Sarah, usually so composed, had an odd tension in her shoulders. "All right, folks," she began, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "Most of this is common sense. No unauthorized access to closed areas, report any equipment malfunctions immediately, standard stuff." She clicked to the next slide on the projector, and the mood in the room seemed to shift. A few of the older staff members exchanged uneasy glances. The new recruits, myself included, leaned forward, a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity on our faces. The slide was titled in bold sans-serif font, "After Hours Etiquette and Essential Rules." "Now these are particularly important," Sarah continued, her gaze sweeping across our faces, lingering a fraction too long on mine. "They are non-negotiable. Breaking them even inadvertently will result in immediate termination, and potentially far worse consequences." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room from one of the younger recruits, quickly stifled by a stern look from Mark. The atmosphere grew thick, suddenly heavy with an unspoken weight. Sarah began to list them one by one, clicking through the slides, each rule more baffling than the last. Rule number 1. Under no circumstances are you to operate any ski lift or gondola between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. This includes emergency situations, unless explicitly authorized by senior management and accompanied by 2 other staff members. She paused, letting the words sink in. No exceptions. Ever. I frowned. Okay, safety first, I guess. But emergency situations, that seemed extreme. Rule number 2. After 9 p.m., all windows in the staff dormitory must be kept closed and blinds drawn. Do not, I repeat, do not look out of any window after that time, regardless of what you might hear or see. This one made a shiver run down my spine. Regardless of what you might hear or see? What exactly were we not supposed to see or hear? I glanced at the window behind Sarah, now just a dark rectangle reflecting the dim interior lights. The vast, empty expanse of the mountain outside felt suddenly less inviting, more watchful. Rule number 3. If you hear any unusual sounds coming from the surrounding forest, particularly from the upper slopes, during the night, ignore them. Do not investigate. Do not approach. Do not acknowledge. If the sound persists, report it to Mark or myself the following morning. Do not discuss it with other staff members. My stomach clenched. Unusual sounds? The mountain was full of wildlife, for crying out loud. Bears, coyotes, maybe even a stray cougar. Why such a stark warning against investigation? And why the secrecy? Rule number 4. Personal radios, walkie-talkies, or any devices capable of receiving long-range, unfiltered radio signals are strictly forbidden after resort operating hours. If you possess such a device, it must be stored in a locker in the main office until morning. This one seemed overkill, paranoid even. What kind of rogue radio signals were they worried about? Alien broadcasts? Government conspiracies? Rule number 5. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to venture beyond the marked trails or resort boundaries after sundown, especially not towards the Old Mill Road or the Whispering Ravine. Those areas are off-limits for a reason. Mark, who had been silent up to this point, cleared his throat, his cheerful demeanor completely gone. Look, folks, I know some of these sound odd, he said, his voice unusually low, but they are here for your safety. This isn't your average resort. The mountains can be unpredictable. Respect the rules and you'll be fine. The meeting ended soon after, leaving a palpable tension in the air. As we filed out, I tried to catch the eye of a few of the other new hires, hoping to share a bewildered shrug, a silent acknowledgement of the weirdness. But they all seemed to avoid my gaze, hurrying out with an almost frantic urgency. Back in my dorm room, the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of fiery red and deep purple. It was beautiful, but the beauty now felt laced with something sinister. I tried to rationalize the rules. Maybe there were some dangerous local legends, or particularly aggressive wildlife. Perhaps a history of accidents in those forbidden areas. The radio rule was still a head-scratcher, though. I unpacked my few belongings, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I pulled out my old MP3 player, plugging in my headphones, desperate for some familiar music to drown out the lingering echoes of Sarah's stern voice. As night fully descended, an inky blackness swallowed the mountain, illuminated only by the distant, cold gleam of the stars. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. During the day, the resort was bustling, vibrant. Laughter echoed across the slopes, the cheerful hum of the snowcats preparing the runs, the friendly chatter of colleagues. But as evening approached, a subtle change would sweep through the staff, a quietness, an almost imperceptible tightening in their expressions. Doors would click shut with unnecessary finality, blinds would be drawn with a swift, practiced motion. It was as if a silent alarm went off, signaling a shift from the bright, friendly resort to something else entirely. I found myself unconsciously obeying the rules. I kept my window closed, though I occasionally found myself drawn to the edge of the drawn blind, my ear pressed against the glass, listening. The sounds were mostly normal, the wind whistling, the creak of the old lodge, the occasional distant howl of an animal, but sometimes there was something else, a faint rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from deep within the mountain, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, or a high-pitched, almost musical whine that seemed to drift on the wind, then vanish as quickly as it came. Each time I'd pull back from the window, my own heart thudding, telling myself it was just my imagination. fueled by the bizarre rules and the isolation. Then came the night of the second tremor. It was close to midnight. I was lying in my bunk, trying to read a tattered paperback, but my mind kept drifting. The lodge was eerily silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and groan of the old building. I felt a strange urge to look out the window. It was a compulsion, a pull I couldn't quite explain. My hand twitched towards the blind cord. "Don't look," Sarah's voice echoed in my head, "regardless of what you might hear or see." But the silence was getting to me. I needed to see something, anything, to break the oppressive stillness. Just a quick peek, a glimpse of the stars, perhaps. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the cord. My fingers brushed the plastic, and just as I was about to pull, a sound sliced through the quiet. It wasn't a thump or a whine. It was a scream. A long, drawn-out, utterly inhuman shriek that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. It wasn't the scream of an animal caught in a trap. It was something deeper, more guttural, laced with an agonizing terror that resonated in my very bones. It seemed to come from the upper slopes, somewhere beyond the tree line, echoing down the valley. My blood ran cold. Every muscle in my body locked up. I froze, my hand still poised over the blind cord, my breath hitched in my throat. The scream faded, leaving behind an even more profound, terrifying silence. And then I heard it again. Not a scream this time, but a series of quick, rhythmic thuds, like something heavy being dragged across the snow, moving towards the resort. My eyes darted to the window, to the black rectangle of the drawn blind. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what was out there, to understand. But Sarah's warning, "Do not, I repeat, do not look out of any window after that time, regardless of what you might hear or see," rang in my ears like a death knell. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dragging sounds grew faintly louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was close, too close. And it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a coyote. It was something else. Something that moved with a heavy, deliberate purpose. Something that had just let out a scream that would forever haunt my nightmares. I backed away from the window slowly, my eyes fixed on the blind, as if the darkness beyond it held a tangible threat. My hand trembled as I fumbled for the light switch, plunging the room into a sudden, blinding brilliance. The sounds outside seemed to momentarily recede, or perhaps I simply couldn't hear them over the frantic pounding in my ears. I sat on the edge of my bunk, shivering, pulling the thin blanket tighter around myself. My rational mind tried desperately to find an explanation. A prank? A very elaborate, terrifying prank by the older staff members to scare the new hires. But the scream, that scream felt too real, too raw to be faked. The dragging sounds didn't return that night. The growling faded. But the silence that followed felt heavier, darker than before. It was a silence filled with unspoken horrors, a silence that confirmed everything I had tried to dismiss as overactive imagination. The rules weren't just quirky or paranoid, they were vital. And whatever they were designed to protect us from, or perhaps to protect it from us, was very, very real. The mountain, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage. And I, the eager new recruit, was trapped inside with a truth far more chilling than any cold. If you're enjoying this descent into the chilling unknown, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to keep these unsettling stories coming. The morning after the scream was a surreal tapestry of ordinary and utterly terrifying. The sun rose, painting the peaks in the same golden hues as before, and for a fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. But the lingering echo of that primal shriek and the heavy, scraping sounds were too vivid, too deeply etched into my memory to be dismissed. My eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, my nerves frayed. I walked to the main lodge for breakfast, forcing myself to adopt a semblance of normalcy. The dining hall was abuzz with the usual morning chatter, the clatter of cutlery, the smell of burnt coffee. Everyone seemed normal. Too normal, perhaps. I scanned the faces of my colleagues, looking for any sign of recognition, any shared tremor of fear from the night before. No one met my gaze for long. Mark was laughing loudly at a table with some other senior staff, his usual boisterous self. Sarah was quietly sipping her coffee, her expression unreadable. I tried to casually approach a few of the newer hires, the ones who had been in the off-hours briefing with me. "Rough night, huh?" I attempted with a nervous chuckle to a young woman named Chloe, a ski instructor. She merely glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Yeah, always takes a while to adjust to the altitude," she mumbled, quickly turning back to her plate. Her dismissal was abrupt, almost rehearsed. I tried another, a guy named Ben, who worked in equipment rental. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, lowering my voice conspiratorially. Ben's fork clattered onto his plate. He looked up, his eyes wide, then immediately darted around the room. "Hear what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just the wind. You gotta get used to the wind up here, man. Plays tricks on you." He then got up abruptly, mumbling something about needing more coffee, and left the table. Their reactions solidified my growing dread. They knew, or they sensed something, and they were terrified. This wasn't just a quirk of the mountain, or a prank. This was a shared, unspoken burden, a secret carefully guarded by a wall of deliberate ignorance. The day job was a welcome distraction. Operating the lift, guiding eager skiers onto the chairs, the repetitive motion, the constant stream of small talk, it all helped to push the horrors of the night into the background. But as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in fiery oranges and purples, the unease would creep back in. The friendly chatter of the resort began to thin, replaced by a growing quietude. The lifts stopped running, their cables sighing as they settled. The last few skiers glided down, their shouts echoing in the rapidly cooling air before disappearing into the warming glow of the lodges. As dusk deepened, the transformation became complete. The resort shed its vibrant, welcoming facade, and the mountain itself seemed to exhale. The crisp, invigorating air of the day became a cold, heavy blanket, pressing down on everything. The distant pines, once picturesque, now loomed like sentinels, their dark forms blending seamlessly with the encroaching shadows. I found myself meticulously following the rules. My window was sealed, the blind drawn tight. I didn't venture out after dark, not even to the common room for a game of cards. The incident had burned itself into my consciousness, leaving an indelible mark. But while I obeyed, my mind was anything but at peace. The desire to understand, to pierce through the veil of secrecy, gnawed at me with relentless persistence. I started observing my colleagues more closely. At night, their movements became strangely ritualistic. They'd secure their doors with extra locks, pull their blinds with a tension that spoke volumes. Conversations would drop to hushed tones after the evening meal, often ending abruptly if anyone seemed to be listening too intently. There was a palpable sense of anxiety that permeated the dorms after sundown, a shared, silent pact of vigilance. One evening, I overheard two older maintenance workers, grizzled men with years of mountain life etched onto their faces, talking in low voices in the communal kitchen. I pretended to be engrossed in cleaning my mug, straining to catch their words. "Happened again last night," one mumbled, his voice gravelly. "Thought it was dormant," the other replied, a tremor in his tone. "The new ones, that they don't know the full scope." "Ignorance is bliss sometimes," the first one sighed. "Keeps them from panicking. Keeps it from noticing." My heart pounded. They weren't just talking about a bear, they were talking about it. I wanted to burst in, to demand answers, but I knew such an action would only shut them down. They suddenly went silent, sensing my presence, and quickly changed the subject to the weather forecast. I returned to my room, my mind reeling. The implications were chilling. They were actively trying to keep us, the new recruits, in the dark, and for its sake, not just ours. My investigation began subtly. I started spending my lunch breaks in the resort's small, underutilized library. It was mostly filled with outdated travel guides and local history books. I scoured the shelves, looking for anything that might shed light on local legends, unexplained phenomena, or obscure historical incidents related to Silverpeak. Most of it was bland, tourist-oriented fare. But then, tucked away behind a stack of glossy brochures, I found an old, unbound collection of local newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, dating back decades. Many were innocuous: ski race results, town council meetings, seasonal events. But a few caught my eye. Unexplained disappearances in Silverpeak Valley, 1958. Search continues for missing hiker. Local authorities baffled, 1973. Lone cabin dweller vanishes. Only remains found are disturbed snow, 1989. The articles were vague, offering no clear explanations, often concluding with theories about exposure or animal attacks. But the sheer number of them, spanning decades, was unsettling. They all seemed to occur in the late autumn or early winter, just as the resort was preparing for its peak season, and many mentioned the upper slopes or beyond the marked trails. My gaze fell upon a particularly faded clipping from 1965. The headline read, "Silverpeak Mine Shuts Down Permanently After Tragic Collapse. Local Legend Speaks of Mountain's Fury." The article talked about a forgotten silver mine high on the mountain, which had suffered a catastrophic collapse, burying several miners. Locals at the time had attributed it to the mountain's anger, or the spirits disturbed. Superstitious nonsense, I initially thought, but then I remembered rule number 5. Never under any circumstances attempt to venture beyond the marked trails or resort boundaries after sundown, especially not towards the Old Mill Road or the Whispering Ravine. Those areas are off limits for a reason. And then I recalled a passing mention of the Old Mill Road being a route to an abandoned mining facility. A cold dread seeped into my bones. Could the mine collapse have been more than just an accident? The more I delved, the more the pieces started to coalesce into a disturbing pattern. The disappearances, the mine incident, the bizarre rules, the terrified silence of the staff. It wasn't random. It was connected. Something ancient, something powerful resided in these mountains, and the rules were merely a desperate attempt to coexist with it, to placate it, or perhaps to avoid drawing its full attention. My nights became a relentless cycle of paranoia and investigation. I'd sit by my window, drawn blind still firmly shut, straining my ears, my senses heightened. The thumping sounds from deep within the mountain became more frequent, more distinct. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of machinery. It was organic, heavy, almost like something vast moving beneath the earth. And sometimes, intermingled with the wind's howl, I'd catch faint snatches of what sounded like distant, mournful singing. A low, resonant chant that seemed to carry on the icy air, devoid of words yet filled with an ancient sorrow. It would start subtly, barely audible, then slowly swell, filling the night with its unsettling melody before fading back into the wind's embrace. One particularly cold night, the temperature plummeted and the air hung heavy and still. There was no wind, no distant animal calls, just an absolute, suffocating silence. I was trying to sleep, but my nerves were on edge. Then, from directly outside my window came a soft, almost imperceptible tap. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, rhythmic, like a fingertip gently brushing against the glass. It couldn't be the wind. There was no wind. My heart began to race. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay still, to not acknowledge it. But the sound was so persistent, so deliberate. It felt inquisitive. Tap, tap, tap. It continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I lay there, rigid, staring at the black rectangle of my window blind, imagining something unseen just inches away on the other side of the glass. Something that had been trying to get my attention. Something that knew I was there. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through every bizarre rule, every whispered warning. My logic was crumbling, piece by agonizing piece. The altitude sickness and wind plays tricks excuses of my colleagues now seemed flimsy, transparent. They weren't trying to hide the truth from me for my sake. They were trying to hide it from it. The next day I approached Mark, feigning a casual air. "Hey Mark," I began as he was checking a lift mechanism. "I was just wondering, what exactly is the Whispering Ravine? I saw it on an old map." Mark straightened up slowly, his back to me, his shoulders tensing. He didn't turn around. Just an old trail, kid. Too steep, too dangerous. We closed it years ago for safety reasons. Landslides, you know." His voice was flat, devoid of his usual cheerful booming. "Right," I pressed, "but the rules specifically say never to go near it after sundown. Is there something else there? Something specific?" He finally turned, his face uncharacteristically grim. His eyes, usually crinkled in a smile, were hard, unyielding. "Listen, you're new here. You got a good job. Don't go poking around where you don't belong. There are things on this mountain that are best left undisturbed. You follow the rules, you keep your head down, you stay safe. Understand?" His tone left no room for argument. It was a warning, stark and unequivocal. But the warning didn't deter me. If anything, it fueled my morbid curiosity. Things best left undisturbed. What kind of things? The fear was still present, a cold knot in my stomach. But now it was tinged with a desperate need for answers. My logical mind had completely abandoned me, replaced by a primal urge to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. That night I decided to push the boundaries just a little. I had found an old tattered resort map in the library, one that predated the closed designations for Old Mill Road and Whispering Ravine. It showed a small, faded X marked at the very end of the Old Mill Road, deep in the less frequented parts of the mountain. Above the X, a barely legible handwritten note, scrawled in an ancient looping script, simply read, "The Mouth." After 9 p.m., with the lodge locked down and the blinds drawn, I carefully, silently, retrieved my small, cheap digital camera from my backpack. It wasn't a radio, so it technically wasn't forbidden. I knew it was a foolish, reckless act, but I couldn't stop myself. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I crept to my window, my hand shaking as I slowly, agonizingly nudged the bottom corner of the blind, just enough to create a sliver of an opening, no wider than my thumb. I pressed my eye to the gap, peering out into the inky blackness. The stars were out, piercing pinpricks of light in a vast, indifferent sky. The familiar shapes of the pines stood sentinel, their branches laden with fresh snow, looking like skeletal fingers reaching up into the darkness. It was quiet. Too quiet. I held my breath, scanning the tree line, the distant slopes. Nothing. Just the vast, empty expanse of the mountain, bathed in the faint, ethereal glow of the moonlight. I was about to pull the blind shut, chastising myself for being so foolish, when I saw it. It wasn't a sudden, jarring apparition. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the darkness. On the very edge of the tree line, where the forest met the cleared slopes, a patch of shadow seemed to deepen. It was larger than a man, impossibly so, and yet it moved with a fluidity that belied its size. It was as if the darkness itself had congealed, pulling itself into a form that absorbed all light. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, or perhaps swaying, like a colossal phantom, slowly, deliberately, moving along the edge of the forest. I couldn't make out any features, no limbs, no head, just an absence of light, a moving void against the slightly less black backdrop of the pines. And then, as it paused directly opposite my window, though still a considerable distance away, I saw something that made every hair on my body stand on end. 2 pinpricks of light, a faint, malevolent red, materialized within the moving void. They weren't reflecting light, they were emitting it. 2 burning embers, fixed and unwavering, staring directly back at my sliver of an opening. It wasn't just a shadow, it was looking. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze, locked in a primal terror. I felt an overwhelming, bone-deep certainty that it knew I was there, peering out, that it had been waiting for me. The red pinpricks of light seemed to intensify, to burn brighter, as if feeding on my fear. A low, vibrating hum, almost imperceptible, began to fill my room, emanating not from outside, but from somewhere inside my own head. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was a sensation, a pressure behind my eyes, a resonant vibration deep within my skull. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the 2 red lights began to descend, ever so slightly, as if the colossal shadow was lowering itself, bringing its unseen face closer to the ground, closer to my perceived level. The hum intensified, becoming a thrumming roar within my mind, drowning out all other thoughts, all other sensations. I slammed the blind shut, the cheap plastic clattering with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of my room. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, collapsing onto my bunk. My heart was pounding so violently, I thought it would burst through my chest. My hands flew to my head, trying to press away the lingering hum, the phantom echo of those burning red eyes. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't wildlife. It was real. And it was out there. And it had been watching me. The dread that had been a creeping whisper in my mind now screamed. The mountain wasn't just isolated, it was alive. And whatever lived within its depths, whatever the staff were so desperately trying to appease, was aware of my presence. It had seen me. And the terrifying truth was, it seemed to be interested. The following morning, the world seemed to have lost its vibrant edge, replaced by a monochrome filter of perpetual dread. The memory of those twin red eyes burning in the depths of the shadowy form was seared into my mind. The internal hum still echoed faintly behind my ears, a phantom vibration that underscored the terrifying reality of my encounter. Sleep had been an impossible luxury, tormented by fragmented images of an impossible shape and the chilling certainty of being observed. I went through the motions of my day job, a hollow automaton, the cheerful greetings of the skiers, the innocuous banter of my colleagues. It all felt distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. My focus was constantly fractured, my gaze perpetually drawn to the distant tree line, to the edge of the world where darkness had taken on a tangible, malevolent form. Every creak of the lift, every gust of wind, every distant sound sent a jolt of panic through me, my senses now hyper-tuned to threats unseen. The isolation that the mountains once promised as solace had transformed into a crushing weight. I was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone with my burgeoning horror. The collective silence of the other staff, once merely frustrating, now felt like a desperate plea for self-preservation, a grim acceptance of an unspeakable truth. I no longer questioned their secrecy, I understood its necessity. They weren't just keeping me in the dark for my own good, but for the collective safety of the delicate balance they maintained with it. My meals became solitary affairs. I couldn't bring myself to engage in polite conversation, knowing what lurked beneath the surface of this idyllic resort. My eyes, weary and haunted, scanned the faces of Mark and Sarah, seeing not just managers, but custodians of a terrible secret, their forced smiles now seeming like masks designed to hide an abyss of fear. I wondered how long they had lived with this, how many winters they had endured, facing the encroaching darkness. The newspaper clippings I'd found in the library, once dismissed as mere curiosities, now felt like dire warnings, echoes from a grim past that was repeating itself. The unexplained disappearances, the missing hiker, they weren't isolated tragedies. They were patterns, sacrifices, or perhaps simply the cost of the mountain's existence. The handwritten note, the mouth, above the X on the old map, resonated with a new, terrifying implication. A mouth that consumes. My resolve, born of fear, hardened into a desperate, almost obsessive need for more information. I had to understand what I was dealing with, even if that understanding meant losing what little sanity I had left. The rules, which I had initially resented, now became a framework for investigation. If rule number 5 forbade going to the Old Mill Road or Whispering Ravine after sundown, then that was precisely where I needed to go, albeit cautiously. If rule number 4 forbade unfiltered radio signals, then I needed to find out why. My camera, a cheap point-and-shoot, became my closest companion. I started taking photos of everything that seemed out of place, no matter how insignificant. Odd patterns in the snow that didn't look like animal tracks, strange shadows cast by the moon, distant lights that appeared and vanished with unnerving speed. Most of the photos were just blurry images or meaningless darkness, but it was a desperate attempt to gather proof, to solidify the reality of what I was experiencing, lest my mind unravel completely. One afternoon, while working my lift shift, the sky darkened prematurely. Heavy, wet snow began to fall, turning the world into a dizzying swirl of white. Visibility dropped rapidly. The resort announced an early closure, and the last few skiers hurried down the rapidly disappearing slopes. As I helped shut down my lift, securing the chairs, a sudden, blinding whiteout descended. The world dissolved into a featureless expanse of swirling snow. I found myself alone at the lift station, the last one to leave. The wind howled, a mournful, hungry sound that seemed to envelop me. My radio crackled with static. Mark's voice distorted, telling me to get back to the dorm immediately. I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and began my descent. As I walked, the snow seemed to distort perspective, swallowing sounds and shapes. I felt utterly alone, isolated in a vast, cold expanse. Then, through the thick, swirling flakes, I saw something. It was faint at first, a shifting shape amidst the whiteout, just off the marked trail towards the direction of the whispering ravine. It was too large to be a human, too fluid to be a rock covered in snow. It moved with a disturbing grace, a slow, deliberate undulation. My breath hitched. It was the same shadowy mass I had seen outside my window, but now it was closer, much closer. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze, barely breathing, trying to make sense of the impossible sight. It seemed to sway, almost as if sensing my presence, even through the dense snow. I fumbled for my camera, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. I raised it, aimed, and clicked. The flash, a brief blinding burst, illuminated the swirling snow, and for a split second something monstrous. It wasn't a distinct shape, not truly. It was a distortion in the air, a place where the snow seemed to be avoiding, flowing around an unseen mass. But within that distortion, I saw it. A colossal, elongated head, devoid of features, save for two hollow depressions where eyes should be. And from those depressions, a faint internal glow, a pulsating, malevolent red, briefly flared, just for that agonizing fraction of a second. Then the flash died, and the whiteout swallowed the vision again. The silence that followed was broken only by the shriek of the wind, now seeming to carry a new unsettling quality, a low guttural growl that felt like it was reverberating in the very snow beneath my feet. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, blindly stumbling through the deep snow, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't stop until I burst through the doors of the staff lodge, collapsing against the wall, covered in snow and shaking uncontrollably. No one seemed to notice my frantic entrance. The common room was mostly empty, a few staff members quietly playing cards. I felt a wave of dizzying relief, quickly followed by a chilling realization. They wouldn't have been out there in the first place. They followed the rules. Back in my room, I fumbled with my camera, my hands still trembling. I needed to see the picture. I needed to know it wasn't a hallucination. I scrolled through the few photos I had taken that day. Snow-covered trees, blurry whiteouts, and then the image. It was grainy, dark, and mostly obscured by the swirling snow. But there, in the center of the frame, was the distortion, the absence of snow. And within it, faint but undeniably present, were the two red pinpricks of light, glowing with an unholy intensity. Proof. Horrifying, undeniable proof. My relief, however, was short-lived. As I zoomed in, a strange pattern began to emerge from the static and grain around the anomaly. Streaks of light, almost like trails of energy, seemed to radiate from the shadowy form, stretching outwards into the whiteout. And within those streaks, barely perceptible, I saw shapes, familiar shapes, faces. Not human faces, not exactly, but outlines, impressions, faces contorted in silent screams, faces that seemed to be twisted, stretched, almost absorbed into the energy radiating from the entity. And one of them, for a horrifying second, seemed vaguely familiar. A face I had seen in one of the old newspaper clippings, the missing hiker from 1973. The camera slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. The entity wasn't just a physical presence, it was something else. Something that could absorb, distort, and perhaps consume the very essence of living beings. The faces were not just reflections, they were imprints, remnants of its past victims, and it could project them, almost like a psychic echo, into the world. My investigation deepened into a frantic, desperate scramble. The mountain was not just home to a monster, It was the monster, or perhaps an extension of it. The whispers, the thumps, the rules, they were all part of a larger terrifying mechanism. I started leaving small items, almost subconsciously, in certain places. A rock on a specific tree branch, a small ribbon tied to a fence post, trying to establish if anything was being moved or altered. It wasn't long before I started finding them changed. The rock might be moved a few feet away, or the ribbon untied and retied in an impossible knot. It was subtle, but it confirmed a chilling hypothesis. It was aware of my actions, it was interacting, and it was playing with me. One evening, as I was returning to my dorm room, I found my door ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it. My heart pounded as I pushed it open slowly, peering into the dim room. Nothing seemed out of place. My sparse belongings were undisturbed, but as I closed the door, I noticed something new. Pinned to my pillow, a single, withered pine cone. Nothing remarkable, except that it wasn't a type of pine cone found commonly around the resort. It was larger, darker, and its scales were strangely elongated, almost claw-like. And as I picked it up, a faint, sweet, cloying scent wafted from it, a smell that reminded me vaguely of old blood and something metallic. This wasn't just a natural occurrence. This was a message, a calling card. The entity was not just observing, it was entering my personal space. It was acknowledging my presence, my intrusion. The psychological toll was immense. My sleep, already fractured, dissolved completely. I existed in a haze of fear and exhaustion, my mind constantly racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this horrifying puzzle. The lines between reality and delusion blurred. I began to hear whispers, even when I knew no one was around, faint, sibilant sounds that seemed to come from the very walls of my room, from the air itself. They weren't words I could understand, but they carried a tone, a menacing cadence that spoke of ancient malevolence. Sometimes when I was alone, I would hear my own name whispered from the deepest corners of the room. It was always soft, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. A chill would run down my spine and I would spin around, heart pounding, only to find nothing but the empty space. It was trying to get to me, to break me down, not with brute force, but with the insidious psychological assault. One night, the whispers intensified. I was lying in my bunk, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The sounds were no longer vague. They coalesced into something more distinct. It wasn't my name this time. It was a voice, a low, rasping murmur, speaking words I couldn't quite grasp, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mimicking a voice I knew. My grandmother's voice. My grandmother, who had passed away years ago. Her soft, comforting tone now twisted, distorted, speaking in a cadence that was utterly alien. It wasn't saying anything coherent, just a stream of guttural, sibilant sounds. But the inflection was hers. The slight lilt, the gentle rasp at the end of certain words. It was her voice, but it wasn't her. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, rocking back and forth. No, no, no. This was impossible. This was my mind unraveling. This was too far. The entity was reaching into my deepest memories, using them against me. It was not just a shadow, it was a psychic parasite, feeding on my fear, twisting my reality. The whispers continued, weaving a tapestry of terror, her distorted voice speaking words that were not words, yet filled with an unbearable malevolence. I felt a cold pressure behind my eyes, a sense of being invaded, violated. My sanity was teetering on a precipice. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of my room, rocking back and forth, chanting softly to myself, trying to drown out the spectral voice, the invading presence. The resort, once a refuge, had become a psychological battleground. The mountain, once majestic, was a looming malevolent entity, and I was trapped, a pawn in a game I didn't understand, being slowly, meticulously, driven to the brink of madness by an unseen, intelligent horror. The horror was no longer just outside the window. It was inside my head, and it knew my deepest secrets, my most cherished memories, ready to twist them into weapons against me. The insidious mimicry of my grandmother's voice had been the ultimate violation. It shattered the last vestiges of my self-control, propelling me into a state of frantic, sleepless desperation. The whispers persisted, faint but constant, a low hum beneath the surface of my consciousness, occasionally coalescing into distorted echoes of familiar sounds, familiar voices. My own voice sometimes, saying things I would never say, contemplating actions I would never consider. It was psychological warfare, an unseen entity systematically dismantling my perception of reality, piece by agonizing piece. My physical appearance began to betray my internal torment. My eyes were sunken, perpetually bloodshot, framed by dark circles that spoke of weeks without true rest. My skin was pallid, my movements jumpy, my gaze constantly darting, searching for threats that were both everywhere and nowhere. I ate little, slept less, existing on adrenaline and a terrifying obsessive need to uncover the truth. The resort staff, once merely reserved, now looked at me with open concern, tinged with a familiar, unspoken fear. They saw the madness creeping in, and they knew its source. The pine cone still sitting on my desk, a dark, claw-like omen, became a focal point of my growing dread. Its strange, cloying scent, a mix of damp earth and something vaguely metallic, clung to the air in my room, a constant reminder of the entity's direct contact. I was no longer merely observing, I was being actively engaged, chosen. The thought both terrified and invigorated me, fueling a morbid resolve. If it wanted to play, I would play. But I would play by my own rules as much as possible. My investigation became less about gathering proof for others and more about understanding for myself. I didn't care if anyone believed me anymore. I just needed to know. The old map, with its cryptic "The Mouth" annotation, beckoned like a siren song. The forbidden areas of the Old Mill Road and the Whispering Ravine, once mere points of curiosity, now pulsed with a dark, magnetic allure. They were the heart of the mystery, and I knew with a chilling certainty that I had to go there. I spent my few free hours poring over the old newspaper clippings again, searching for any deeper connections. The missing hikers, the mine collapse, the sudden closures of small isolated cabins, they all pointed to a pattern, a cyclical nature. The incidents always seemed to peak in late autumn, just before the full onslaught of winter, and then again in early spring as the snow began to recede. It was almost as if the entity was more active or more hungry during these transitional periods. The current timing, mid-October, placed me squarely in the midst of its heightened activity. Then, buried in the very bottom of the old box of clippings, I found something different. Not a newspaper article, but a folded, fragile sheet of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age. It was a crude hand-drawn sketch depicting the Silverpeak mountain range. On it, several symbols were inscribed, geometric patterns that looked vaguely ritualistic, surrounding a prominent central point marked with a distorted, almost tooth-like emblem. Below the drawing, a faded looping script, entirely in Latin, was barely legible. Montem vocare, animos capere, aeternum famem satiet. My high school Latin was rusty, but I managed to piece it together, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The mountain calls, to capture souls, to satisfy an eternal hunger. The paper crumbled slightly at my touch, releasing a faint, earthy scent, similar to the pine cone. This was it. This was the origin. Not a creature, not an animal, but an ancient, sentient hunger. The mountain itself was the entity, or housed it, a living, breathing, consuming force. And the resort, the rules, they weren't just for safety. They were part of a desperate, futile attempt to appease or contain something primordial. The realization brought a chilling clarity. The Whispering Ravine and Old Mill Road weren't just dangerous because of treacherous terrain. They were points of direct access, arteries to the mouth, the heart of the entity's power. The sounds, the shadows, the mimicry, they were all manifestations of its will, its way of reaching out, of drawing in. My fear, once a primal, instinctual response, now transformed into a colder, more determined resolve. I had to go to the mouth. I had to see it, to understand its true nature. The thought of confronting it was terrifying, but the thought of living in perpetual, unknowing dread, slowly being driven insane by its psychological torment, was worse. I would rather face the truth, however horrific, than succumb to its slow, insidious decay. I began to plan. I needed to be discreet, to go unnoticed. The other staff, already wary, would surely intervene if they suspected my intentions. The no going beyond marked trails after sundown rule was the most critical. I would have to go at night under the cover of darkness when the mountain's true self awakened. For days I meticulously studied the old map, cross-referencing it with the modern resort map, trying to find the safest, most discreet route to the Old Mill Road. It was a treacherous path, marked with jagged cliffs and dense ancient forests. But the X, the mouth, drew me in with an undeniable force. The nights became increasingly active. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just random sounds. They seemed to weave together, forming discordant overlapping voices, sometimes speaking in different languages, ancient tongues I couldn't comprehend. But their meaning was clear. An invitation, a lure. They spoke of understanding, of ultimate knowledge, if only I would venture out, if only I would come closer. They used my name, sometimes with a chilling intimacy, sometimes with an accusatory hiss. One night, as I sat rigid in my bunk enduring the onslaught of psychic noise, a single voice broke through the cacophony. It was clear, resonant, and spoke in perfect, unaccented English. It sounded like a woman's voice, smooth and alluring, yet edged with an ancient predatory hunger. Come, seeker, the mountain calls, its wisdom awaits you. Do not fear the cold embrace. It is merely the path to understanding. You are chosen. My breath caught. It was speaking to me directly. No longer just hints, no longer just mimicry. A direct telepathic communication. The entity was intelligent. It knew my thoughts, my intentions. It was not a mindless force. It was a consciousness, an ancient, powerful will. The direct address, the promise of wisdom, was a dangerous allure. It preyed on my desperate need for answers, my morbid curiosity. I knew it was a trap, a siren song designed to lead me to my doom. But the craving for understanding, for an end to the torment, was almost unbearable. I decided to make my move during the next full moon. The increased moonlight, though risky, would offer some visibility on the treacherous paths. It was also, according to my research into local folklore, a time when ancient energies were said to be at their peak. It felt fitting. The day of the full moon arrived, cloaked in a deceptive innocence. The resort was bustling, the slopes gleaming under a brilliant cold sun. I went through my shift, my movements mechanical, my mind already on the night ahead. I packed a small backpack with essentials, a powerful flashlight, a thermos of hot coffee, a compass and my digital camera, its grainy photo of the shadowy entity still a chilling confirmation of my sanity, or lack thereof. As evening descended, the air grew colder, the wind picking up. Dark clouds began to gather, threatening to obscure the full moon. My heart sank. Reduced visibility would make the journey even more perilous. But I couldn't wait. The whispers in my head were growing unbearable, a constant thrumming chorus of ancient voices, punctuated by the alluring, predatory invitation of the woman's voice. At precisely 11 p.m., when the staff lodge was completely silent, every window sealed, every light extinguished, I made my move. I had meticulously chosen my exit point, a seldom used back door in the laundry room, which led out into a less trafficked service alley. It was risky, but less likely to be noticed than the main entrance. I slipped out into the biting cold, the moonlight, still partially visible through the thinning clouds, casting long, eerie shadows. The resort was a ghost town, a silent, slumbering giant. The pristine snow, once inviting, now felt like a vast, empty canvas, waiting for something to be drawn upon it. My breath plumed in the frigid air as I began my ascent, carefully skirting the edges of the marked trails, staying close to the cover of the dense pine forest. The silence of the mountain at night was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the snow and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a snow-laden branch, sent my nerves on edge. The path to Old Mill Road was exactly as the old map had indicated, narrow, winding, and increasingly treacherous. Snowdrifts grew deeper, obscuring the faint, overgrown track. The trees pressed in closer, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of pine and that faint, metallic earthiness I had come to associate with the entity. As I ventured deeper, the familiar whispers began to intensify, no longer just in my head, but seeming to emanate from the very trees around me. They were seductive, promising enlightenment, urging me forward. Closer, come closer. The truth awaits. Peace, understanding. I gripped my flashlight tighter, its beam cutting a trembling path through the encroaching darkness. My resolve wavered, fear threatening to overwhelm me. But the thought of returning to the lodge, to the slow, agonizing descent into madness, spurred me onward. I had to know. I eventually reached a clearing, a flat expanse of snow where the old mill road should have been. But there was no road, just a field of undisturbed snow, bordered by an even denser wall of ancient twisted pines. The air here was strangely still, devoid of wind, yet permeated by a profound, almost resonant silence. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it, or rather felt it. A massive, unseen presence at the center of the clearing. The snow in that area was strangely flattened, almost compressed, as if something colossal rested there. The tree branches around it were bent inwards, as if pulled by an invisible force, creating a natural amphitheater around the anomaly. The whispers in my head intensified, culminating in a deafening chorus of voices, ancient and hungry. And then, from the very center of that flattened snow, a low guttural thrumming began. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that resonated deep within my chest, rattling my teeth. The snow began to shift, not from wind, but from beneath. A slow, agonizing heave. Cracks spiderwebbed across the pristine white surface, revealing glimpses of something dark and ancient beneath. It was organic, yet utterly alien. A pulsating, unseen mass. And then, just as the clouds parted to reveal the full spectral glow of the moon, I saw them. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small, glowing red points began to emerge from the shifting snow, from the darkness beneath the trees, from the very air around the anomaly. Not two like before, but an army of them. They were like tiny, burning embers, floating just above the snow, each one a miniature, malevolent eye. They flickered, pulsed, and turned, all simultaneously, to stare directly at me. They were everywhere, surrounding me, watching, waiting. The chorus of whispers in my head swelled into an unbearable roar, a cacophony of voices all demanding, all inviting, all hungry. And through it all, the clear, alluring voice, now laced with a triumphant, predatory satisfaction, echoed in my mind. You have come, Seeker. The mouth is open, its hunger is eternal, and you are the feast. My blood ran cold, colder than the deepest winter. My legs threatened to give way. The red eyes pulsed, drawing closer, a slow, deliberate encirclement. The thrumming from the shifting snow intensified, growing into a low, resonant groan, as if something gargantuan was slowly, agonizingly awakening. I was no longer just an observer. I was directly in its path, and I had walked right into its embrace. The chilling pronouncement echoed in the cavern of my mind, drowning out the frantic beat of my heart, the frigid bite of the mountain air. You are the feast. The words were not just an invitation, they were a death sentence, delivered with an ancient, triumphant malice. The myriad red pinpricks of light, now swirling around me like a swarm of malevolent fireflies, pulsed with an almost tangible hunger, their collective gaze pinning me in place. The ground beneath me continued its slow, agonizing heave, the snow cracking and groaning as something immense stirred beneath. Panic, raw and absolute, seized me. My flight instinct screamed, demanding I turn and run, blindly scrambling back down the treacherous path. But my limbs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, a terrified statue, my eyes transfixed by the mesmerizing, terrifying dance of the red lights. The alluring woman's voice, now a triumphant crescendo in my head, filled every corner of my consciousness, twisting my thoughts, paralyzing my will. Fear is a delicacy, little one. Your curiosity, a tempting spice. The mountain has waited. The cycle demands. The hum, the resonant vibration that had been building for weeks, now became a deafening roar within my skull, a physical pressure that threatened to shatter my very being. The air itself grew thick, heavy, with the metallic, earthy scent of the withered pine cone now magnified 1,000-fold. It was the smell of ancient primordial hunger, of soil that had drunk deep of terror. Then, from the center of the shifting snow, the ground itself began to open. Not a gentle parting, but a violent rupture, as if the earth was tearing itself apart. Dark, glistening fissures spread outwards, revealing not soil or rock, but something far more horrifying. A black, viscous mass, like congealed shadow, oozed upwards slowly, deliberately. It was organic yet utterly alien, a substance that seemed to absorb the moonlight, leaving nothing but an impossible void. Tendrils, like enormous glistening roots, began to extend from the black mass, snaking outwards, silently slithering across the snow towards me. They moved with a predatory intelligence, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if confident in its inevitable capture. The red lights danced above them, guiding their path. My paralysis finally broke, replaced by a surge of desperate, adrenaline-fueled terror. I let out a choked cry, stumbling backward, tearing my gaze away from the grotesque spectacle. My feet slipped on the loose snow and I fell hard, my camera clattering from my hand. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming, and began to run. Blindly, frantically, I plunged back into the dense pines, not caring about the unmarked trails or the treacherous terrain. I pushed through snow-laden branches, ignoring the sharp sting of frozen needles on my face, the burning in my lungs. My only thought was escape. Escape the red eyes, the black ooze, the terrifying voice that still resonated in my head. But the mountain was not just a physical space, it was an extension of it. The whispers, once confined to my mind, now echoed from the very trees around me, closer, more distinct. They weren't just the entity's voice, they were the voices of countless others, countless victims, all twisted into a chorus of tormented lamentations and seductive promises. "You cannot run," a child's voice whimpered from my left, indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. "Join us?" An old man's raspy tone sighed from above, carried on a gust of wind. The peace, the quiet. A woman's desperate plea resonated from the snow at my feet. They were using the voices of the lost, the echoes of their final moments, to break my will, to lure me back. It was a cruel, brilliant torment. Every familiar tone, every desperate plea, was a psychological anchor designed to drag me down. I pushed harder, tears streaming from my eyes, blurring my vision. The trees grew thicker, the darkness almost absolute. I stumbled over a fallen log, scraping my knee, but didn't stop. The metallic earthy scent was growing stronger, clinging to my clothes, filling my nostrils. I could feel the cold breath of it on my neck, a sensation of ancient, chilling awareness. Then the ground beneath me gave way. Not a fall, but a sickening lurch. I found myself sliding down a steep, snow-covered incline, picking up speed, branches tearing at my jacket, snow filling my mouth. I tumbled, rolling head over heels, until I crashed against something hard and unyielding at the bottom. Dazed, disoriented, I lay for a moment, gasping for air, the world spinning around me. I tried to push myself up, my limbs screaming in protest. My head throbbed, and a warm metallic taste filled my mouth. I had bitten my tongue. As my vision cleared, I realized where I had landed. I was in a small, hidden hollow, a natural depression in the mountain, completely shielded by dense, ancient spruces. The air here was strangely still, even colder than before, and the silence was profound, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. But it was not empty silence. It was a heavy, pregnant stillness. And then I saw it. Before me, half buried in centuries of snow and earth, was what looked like an ancient derelict structure. It was made of rough-hewn stone, crudely stacked, and appeared to be the entrance to something far older than any resort or mine. A large circular opening, almost perfectly carved, lay at the base of the stone edifice, partially obscured by ice and overgrown vegetation. It was vaguely reminiscent of a stylized mouth, its edges rough and jagged, like teeth. This was it, the mouth. As I crawled closer, a faint, ethereal glow emanated from within the opening. It wasn't the red light of the entity, but a softer, pulsing blue, like bioluminescence. A strange, hypnotic melody drifted from the depths, a low, resonant hum, utterly devoid of words, yet filled with a profound, almost melancholic beauty. It was the source of the singing I had heard on those silent nights. I shivered, but not just from the cold. The melody, for all its beauty, carried an undercurrent of infinite sorrow, of an ancient, terrible longing. It was the sound of eternal hunger, perhaps, crying out in the vast emptiness of the mountain. Driven by an irresistible, morbid curiosity, I pulled out my flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, revealing the interior of the stone mouth. It wasn't a natural cave, it was a man-made tunnel, crudely carved, descending into the very heart of the mountain. The walls were uneven, slick with ice and dark mineral-rich earth. And along the walls, carved into the stone, were the same geometric symbols I had seen on the old parchment, repeated over and over, pulsing faintly with the same blue light. As I took a tentative step inside, the metallic earthy scent intensified, mingled now with something else. A faint, almost sickly, sweet odor, like decaying flowers. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, yet strangely invigorating. My head felt light, my thoughts strangely clear, as if the whispers had momentarily receded, replaced by a profound sense of awe and terror. The tunnel wound downwards, spiraling deeper into the earth. The blue light from the symbols grew brighter, illuminating a path of ancient, worn steps. As I descended, I began to see more carvings, not just symbols, but crude pictographs etched into the stone. They depicted stick figures, humans, standing before a colossal, shadowy mass, its form identical to the one I had seen on the slopes. Some figures seemed to be offering something to the shadow, others were being consumed by it, their bodies dissolving into streaks of light that flowed into the central form. It was a history, a horrifying chronicle of the mountain's true nature. It was not just a creature that lived in the mountain, it was the mountain, an ancient consuming entity that demanded sustenance. And that sustenance was us, our fear, our souls. As I reached a wider chamber, the blue light was blinding. It emanated from a central altar, a large, rough-hewn stone slab, covered in the same pulsating symbols, and upon the altar lay a collection of objects. Not gold or jewels, but mundane personal items. A child's worn wooden toy, a faded leather wallet containing a few ancient coins, a tarnished silver locket with a faded photograph inside. These were not offerings to a god, they were the remnants of the consumed, the last vestiges of the lost. My eyes fell upon one item in particular, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. My blood ran cold. I recognized it. It was identical to a carving my own grandfather had made for me when I was a child, a little good luck charm I had kept for years, until it had mysteriously gone missing after a family camping trip years ago, a trip to these very mountains. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My grandfather. He had been a keen hiker, always exploring the wilderness. He had loved these mountains. And he had disappeared, officially listed as lost to the elements, his body never found. The whispers, which had been silent for a moment, returned with a vengeful ferocity. They weren't just general calls now, they were specific. They were his voice. My grandfather's voice, clear and strong, yet laced with an unimaginable agony, spoke from the very walls of the cavern. Run, my child. Flee. It has me. It has all of us. Tears streamed down my face, hot and stinging in the frigid air. My grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken, consumed. His last desperate warning, echoing from the depths of the mountain, was meant for me. The entity had known my grandfather. It had taken him. And now it was calling to me, using his voice, his memory to lure me deeper into its maw. The withered pine cone, the mimicry, the whispers. It had all been a personal invitation, a deliberate psychological assault, meticulously crafted for me. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shuddered violently. Not a heave this time, but a deep, resonant tremor that shook the very foundations of the cavern. The blue light from the symbols intensified, flickering erratically, as if struggling to contain something immense. The air grew colder, the sweet cloying scent becoming overpoweringly sickly. From the deepest recesses of the tunnel, beyond the altar, a new sound emerged. A low, grinding, mechanical groan, utterly out of place in this ancient organic horror. It was the sound of massive, unseen gears turning, of ancient machinery rumbling to life. And then, from the mouth of the tunnel, from the path I had just taken, came a different set of sounds. Not whispers, not spectral voices, but the crunch of heavy boots on snow, the beam of flashlights, voices, human voices, shouting my name. Protagonist's name. Where are you? Mark's voice. Sarah's. They had found me. They had followed me. They were here at the mouth. My heart leaped with a desperate momentary surge of hope. Rescue. Escape. But the hope was quickly extinguished by a chilling realization. They weren't here to save me from the entity. They were here because I had broken the rules. I had ventured into the forbidden, awakened something that was best left undisturbed. And the sound of the grinding machinery intensified, now accompanied by a rhythmic clank, 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 echoing from the very depths of the earth, growing louder, more urgent. It was drawing closer, whatever it was. The mountain was awakening, and I had led my would-be saviors directly to its waiting jaws. The cycle, my grandfather's warning, the ancient hunger, it was all converging. And I was at its epicenter, not just a victim, but an unwilling catalyst. Before we plunge into the horrifying climax, what do you believe is the terrible truth behind this mountain's mystery? Leave your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the chilling conclusion. The shouts of Mark and Sarah, echoing from the tunnel entrance, were a discordant symphony against the increasingly frantic hum within my skull and the grinding mechanical groans from the mountain's depths. Hope, fleeting and fragile, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. They weren't here to save me from it. They were here to contain me, to prevent me from irrevocably disrupting the delicate, terrifying balance. I had violated their sacred rules, and in doing so had drawn its full, terrible attention. The grinding noise intensified, now joined by a high-pitched metallic whine, as if colossal, rusted gears were being forced into motion after centuries of dormancy. The blue light from the symbols on the altar and walls pulsed violently, flickering like a dying heart, casting dancing shadows that writhed and twisted around me. The air in the cavern grew heavy, suffocating, saturated with the sickly, sweet scent of decay and that distinct metallic earthiness. Protagonist's name. Don't go any further. Sarah's voice, laced with a desperation I hadn't heard before, pierced through the growing cacophony. I stood transfixed, caught between the encroaching horror behind me and the approaching, terrified humanity before me. My grandfather's voice, a raw, primal scream now, echoed from the altar. "Flee! It watches! It waits!" Then, Mark's burly form appeared in the entrance of the tunnel, followed closely by Sarah. Their flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating my terrified face and the ancient, glowing altar behind me. Their eyes widened in horror, not just at me, but at the full, terrifying spectacle of the awakened chamber. The blue light, the grinding, the pulsating symbols, they knew exactly what I had unleashed. "What have you done?" Mark bellowed, his voice cracking with fear and fury. He took a hesitant step forward, then froze as the mechanical groaning escalated into a guttural, earth-shaking rumble. The entire cavern began to tremble violently, dust and small stones raining down from the ceiling. From beyond the altar, from the deepest, blackest recess of the tunnel, a new sound emerged, a wet, tearing noise, like ancient roots being ripped from the earth, followed by a colossal, sucking thwump. The grinding intensified, and the very ground beneath us buckled and groaned. The black viscous ooze I had seen earlier began to well up from the fissures around the altar, no longer sluggish but bubbling and seething with a repulsive energy. It spread rapidly across the floor, forming shimmering, shifting pools that reflected the erratic blue light. And within those pools, shapes began to coalesce, distorted, ephemeral faces, twisting and screaming in silent agony, their features vaguely familiar, echoing the images from my camera. My grandfather's face among them, clear and agonizingly real. "It's alive!" I choked out, my voice raw. "The mountain, it's alive! It feeds on us!" Sarah let out a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark stared, his face a mask of utter despair. "You fool," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You woke it up, you broke the cycle." "The cycle?" I demanded, the words tumbling out. "What cycle? What is this thing?" As if in answer, the rhythmic clank, clank, clank from the deeper tunnel intensified, growing louder, closer. And then, from the mouth of the tunnel beyond the altar, a monstrous, impossible form began to emerge. It wasn't the shadowy, amorphous mass I had seen on the slopes. This was its true, terrifying heart. It was a colossal ancient machine, a grotesque fusion of organic and mechanical. Massive, rusted gears, larger than any man, churned slowly, meshed with what looked like enormous, petrified tree roots. Dark, obsidian-like plates formed its exterior, adorned with the same glowing blue symbols. Tendrils of the black, viscous ooze pulsed along its surface, as if it were its lifeblood. At its center, a gaping maw ringed with razor-sharp, crystalline teeth, slowly opened and closed with a sickening schlick sound, revealing a swirling void within. This was the mouth, in its literal, terrifying manifestation. And within that void, thousands, millions of the tiny red pinpricks of light flickered, like a cosmic congregation of malevolent eyes, all focused on us. The entity was not a creature in the mountain. It was the mountain's engine, its consuming heart, an ancient horror powered by something unspeakable. The alluring woman's voice, now emanating not from my mind, but from the very core of the monstrous machine, boomed, filling the chamber with a resonant, triumphant power. The sacrifice, the tribute, the fear. It sustains, the mountain thrives, and you, little trespasser, have brought it a fresh harvest. "No, get out!" Mark screamed, finally snapping out of his stupor. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back towards the entrance tunnel. "We have to seal it, now!" But it was too late. As they turned, a wave of the black, viscous ooze erupted from the fissures, surging forward with terrifying speed. It enveloped the stone altar, dissolving the remnants of the lost, then snaked towards us, tendrils reaching like predatory claws. "What about the rules?" I shrieked, my voice cracking, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming horror. "What were they for?" Sarah, her face streaked with tears, turned back, her eyes meeting mine, filled with a desperate, hopeless despair. "The rules? They were never for us," she sobbed, her voice barely audible over the roaring machine. "They were for it, to keep it docile, to give it just enough so it wouldn't fully awaken. We offered it the occasional lost soul, the unexplained disappearances, to keep the main harvest contained. The truth, when it finally hit me, was worse than any monster. We weren't just protecting ourselves from it, we were feeding it. The resort, the staff, the very presence of humanity on this mountain was part of an ancient, horrific pact. The unexplained disappearances were not accidents. They were controlled offerings, sacrifices made to keep the colossal engine of consumption from fully awakening and devouring everything. And I, in my desperate, foolish quest for answers, had broken the pact. I had woken the slumbering god. The tendrils of black ooze reached Mark and Sarah. They screamed, not in pain, but in sheer, unadulterated terror, as the substance wrapped around them, pulling them into its depths. Their flashlights clattered to the ground, their beams spinning wildly before being swallowed by the spreading darkness. Their forms distorted, their screams quickly muffled, then extinguished, as they were absorbed into the glistening, pulsating mass. Their faces, translucent and agonizing, flickered in the black ooze for a moment, then vanished, becoming part of the swirling maelstrom of souls. I was alone. Surrounded by the roaring machine, the bubbling ooze and the chorus of tortured whispers that now included Mark's and Sarah's tormented pleas. The maw of the machine, the mouth, opened wider, its crystalline teeth clanking with a deafening resonance. The void within it deepened, a vortex of pure, consuming darkness. The red lights within pulsed with an insatiable hunger, all focused on me, the final, unwitting offering. The black ooze, now an ocean, surged towards me, tendrils reaching, pulling. I tried to run, to scream, but my voice was choked, my legs like lead. The whispers were deafening, a symphony of suffering and dark promises. Join us. Understand. Be one. My vision blurred. The cavern spun. The metallic earthy scent became overwhelming, filling my lungs, burning my nostrils. I felt a cold touch on my ankle, then another, pulling me down, dragging me into the bubbling, seething mass. The cold was absolute, piercing to the bone, yet I could still feel the excruciating sensation of my skin tingling, then burning, as the ooze enveloped me. My body began to dissolve, not painfully, not physically, but spiritually. I could feel my consciousness stretching, distorting, becoming attenuated. The voices of the lost flooded my mind, their memories, their final moments, their terror, all rushing in, overwhelming my own identity. I saw their lives, their loves, their fears, and then their consumption. My grandfather's face, etched in eternal agony, flickered before my fading vision. I was becoming one with them, one with the mountain, one with the mouth. My own fear, my desperate struggle, was merely fuel for the ancient engine, a final, delicious offering. The last thought that flickered through my rapidly dissolving mind was not of escape, but of a horrifying, profound understanding. The rules were not a prison. They were a carefully crafted illusion. The resort was not a place of escape. It was a complex, elaborate trap. And the staff, the knowing ones, were merely shepherds, herding the unsuspecting into the mountain's waiting maw, ensuring its eternal hunger was satisfied, just enough to keep it from taking everything. My physical form ceased to exist. My individual consciousness, once so vibrant, so consumed by the need for answers, splintered into a million fragments, absorbed into the collective agony, the eternal hum of the consumed. I became a whisper among countless whispers, a red light among millions of red lights watching, waiting, an eternal part of the mountain's terrifying sentience. The grinding slowed, the maw closed with a final resonant schlick. The blue lights dimmed to a soft, barely perceptible glow. The black ooze receded, leaving the stone altar clean, waiting. The cavern fell silent save for the faint, melancholic hum of the mountain's satisfied, slumbering heart. Outside, the first faint rays of dawn touched the snow-capped peaks, painting the world in a deceptive, pristine white. A new bus filled with eager new recruits for the upcoming ski season was already making its way up the winding mountain road, their faces alight with excitement for their fresh start. And somewhere deep within the ancient living mountain, a single withered pine cone lay forgotten on a silent stone altar, exuding its faint, sickly, sweet scent, waiting for the cycle to begin anew. The mountain always calls, and its hunger is eternal.